In history, there stood a city named Stalingrad. In 1942, Adolf Hitler's Nazi army launched a significant assault on this city. The attacking forces took great pride in their artillery power. Conversely, the Russian Red Army, tasked with defending the city, was determined to protect it at all costs. As such, this conflict wasn't just a battle between two cities, but a showdown between two dictators. The resolve and spirit of both their ideologies and soldiers created a narrative so profound that it resonates to this day. This savage battle enshrines Stalingrad in history because never before in human history had a single city's battle resulted in more than 2 million casualties and injuries. No other battle had seen 1,000 aircraft shot down, but it happened here. This pivotal battle of World War II raises questions. Why was such a decisive conflict fought? What was the outcome? And why is this battle referred to as the Battle of the Rats? In this episode, we will shed light on these queries. The Battle of Stalingrad was fought during World War II, specifically in 1942. By this time, almost 3 years had passed since the start of the Second World War. In Europe, Hitler's Nazi Germany had already defeated major adversaries like France and Britain. Britain was now struggling to preserve its territories, and the Germans had successfully occupied France. Most European nations were either under German control or had allied with them, with only a few, like Switzerland, remaining neutral. In this backdrop, the Soviet Union, the largest nation in the world, while still considerably free, was facing increasing pressure from the German forces. Hitler's army had already reached the outskirts of the Russian capital, Moscow. Leningrad in the northwest was under siege, and most of the Soviet territories up to Ukraine in the south were occupied by the Germans. In these circumstances, the Soviet forces in the southern regions relied on the extensive Volga River as their primary supply line, spanning nearly 3,000 kilometers. Via the Volga, they received arms and aid from Moscow. Cutting off this river would effectively sever southern Soviet territories from the central hub in Moscow, risking regions rich in oil, like Chechnya and Azerbaijan, to fall into German hands. Fuel was undoubtedly crucial during wartime. Thus, Hitler aimed to sever the Volga's supply line. Upon inspecting a map, it becomes evident that several points along the river could be targeted to disrupt the southern Soviet supply. Yet Hitler chose to cut it off near the western city of Stalingrad. This decision had two apparent motivations. First, from a strategic perspective, Stalingrad's factories were a primary source of tanks and artillery for the Russian forces. Second, from a psychological standpoint, the city was named after the Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin. Capturing this could have decisively broken the morale of the Russian forces. Consequently, Hitler ordered the supply lines along the Volga to be severed from Stalingrad. On the 28th of June, 1942, two armies were dispatched from Ukraine. Army Group A turned southward towards southern Russia, while Army Group B advanced towards Stalingrad. The infantry heading to Stalingrad was named the 6th Army, which was accompanied by tank divisions known as panzers. Initially, this army numbered around 270,000 troops. In the following months, with reinforcements, the strength swelled to over 1 million. The force included contingents from Germany's allies, Italy, Romania, Hungary, Austria, and Croatia. Although the exact number isn't clear, it was a substantial force for the assault on the Russians. On the other hand, the Russians in Stalingrad were not caught off guard. They were preparing diligently for the impending German assault. A brief look at the city reveals that Stalingrad stretched for about 30 kilometers and had a population nearing 400,000. The Don River flowed to the west of the city and the Great Volga to the east. The city was divided into a northern and southern section. Most factories were located in the north, with a significant railway station in between. The majority of the populace resided in the south. To safeguard the city, the first Russian move was to transfer the largest stockpile of grain and livestock across the Volga to keep it out of German hands. However, the 400,000 citizens who depended on these supplies were forcibly retained in the city. Soviet dictator Stalin believed that the presence of civilians would inspire the Russian troops to fight more fervently. During the war, all men and women aged 16 to 55 were conscripted. Women and older children were handed shovels to dig trenches, hindering the advance of German tanks. Additionally, to protect the petrol reserves on the Volga banks, even younger children were pressed into labor, a form of child labor that was seen almost universally during the Great War. These children were tasked with carrying dirt on stretchers to construct protective walls around the petrol reserves. Anti-aircraft guns in the city were also manned by women. Stalin decreed that anyone capable of wielding a weapon should defend the city, and those attempting to flee would be shot. Initially, the Russian army in Stalingrad numbered just 106,000. However, due to continuous reinforcements from across the country, this number surged to 1.1 million by the end of the conflict. During these Russian preparations, on the 23rd of August, when German troops reached the banks of the Volga to the north of Stalingrad, it wasn't a surprise for the Russian forces. They were fully prepared for it. Soon after, German aircraft appeared in the sky, leading the beautiful city down a path of destruction. On August 23rd, the German Air Force initiated its assault on Stalingrad, launching 1,600 attacks on the very first day. Throughout these assaults, German planes dropped a staggering 1,000 tons of bombs. This bombardment incinerated every wooden structure within the city. Even concrete buildings were reduced to rubble. The petroleum storage facilities by the river, along with much of the city's infrastructure, were decimated. This bombardment was particularly distressing for the Russian women operating the anti-aircraft guns. Due to their inexperience, they managed to shoot down only 3 enemy aircraft. However, some female gunners engaged in a memorable combat that somewhat offset the earlier shortcomings. Their valor marked a notable episode in the war. Specifically, in the city's northwest, 37 anti-aircraft guns operated entirely by women were installed. These brave women pivoted their guns toward the advancing German tanks and opened fire. In retaliation, the German tanks began their assault. The confrontation lasted for hours, inflicting significant damage upon the Germans. Yet in the end, all the 37 guns were destroyed by the Germans, with the female gunners either killed or forced to hide in trenches. The realization that they were contending against Russian women took the Germans by surprise. Nonetheless, the Germans continued their aerial raids on the city. Approximately 40,000 civilians were killed in air raids within just a week. Due to the relentless bombardment, women, children, and the injured were evacuated from the city by boats on August 28th. However, male civilians were obliged to stay and assist their army. During this time, the German forces continued their efforts to encircle the city. By August 31st, they had secured the southern banks of the Volga River. Their military contingents also reached the western part, effectively surrounding the city from 3 sides. The only potential aid to the Russians could come from the east across the river. But this route was also under the constant threat of German aerial and ground bombardments. The Russian troops in Stalingrad were essentially trapped. After securing the encirclement, the Germans began systematic advances into different parts of the city on September 13th, spearheaded by the German Air Force. Consider the intensity of the aerial onslaught. From September 16th to 25th, that is, in just 9 days, Stalingrad suffered 9,746 air raids. This equates to an average of 963 raids daily. The aerial supremacy of the German aircraft was so pronounced that no Russian plane dared enter Stalingrad during the day. Russian aircraft operated under the cover of night, launching minor attacks on the Germans and swiftly retreating. In essence, the Germans had achieved complete air superiority over Stalingrad. To evade the German Air Force, the Russians devised a new strategy, colloquially termed hugging the Germans. Embrace the Germans. This strategy implied that Russian soldiers would engage the Germans at such close quarters that German aircraft wouldn't have the option to bomb them. Obviously, if the Germans had bombed, they would have risked hitting their own soldiers. Following this strategy, the Russians turned every house and every street of Stalingrad into a battleground. When Germans would seize one building, Russians would position themselves in the next. As Germans advanced, Russian soldiers would navigate through sewage lines and trenches, returning to the previously occupied building, forcing the Germans to fight for it once again. This cat-and-mouse-style warfare frustrated the Germans to such an extent that they termed it the Rat War. Soon, this Rat War escalated to battles for individual rooms in ruined buildings. Positions would be reported as, "We've taken control of the kitchen in this building. Fighting continues for the bedroom. And we need this and this. Send quickly." Despite the Germans' tactics, the Russians strategically wore them down to the point where they couldn't maintain control over any significant targets. For instance, the city's railway station changed hands 14 times in just 6 hours, eventually falling under German control. Similarly, in a grain storage where food supplies for the soldiers were stored, merely 50 Russians held off thousands of Germans for 5 days. 40 of them were killed, but the remaining 10 escaped, setting the grain on fire on their way out. Another facet of Russian resistance was the snipers. Stalingrad, reduced to rubble, provided numerous hideouts for them. Among these ruins, a Russian sniper named Vasily Zaitsev eliminated 225 Germans. The renowned film Enemy at the Gates was inspired by this Russian sniper's story, albeit with some fictional elements. But even with such fierce resistance from the Russians, German soldiers continued to make progress into the city. Though the advance was slow, it persisted. By the beginning of October, the Germans had mostly captured the southern part of the city. On October 7, the German forces hoisted the Nazi flag in the southern region, and German media declared it conquered. The battle then shifted to the northern part of the city, known for its factories. This was Stalingrad's industrial area, with the most famous being the Stalingrad tractor factory. In 1942, this factory served as a major defensive line for the Russians. On October 14, the Germans launched a massive assault on the tractor factory. Fierce battles for nearby factories ensued. Yet again, the Russians successfully implemented the hugging the German strategy, taking positions in various parts of these vast plants to combat the German forces. Even when relentless German bombings destroyed buildings, the Russians turned the ruins into defensive positions and continued fighting. By the end of October, after incurring heavy losses, the Germans managed to capture these factories one by one. After which a victory celebration ensued, however, it was premature to rejoice. How so? By the time it was November 1942, the vast majority, 90% of the city, was under German control. Yet, along the banks of the Volga River, pockets of resistance remained, where Russian soldiers were still resolutely standing their ground. Nevertheless, the rest of the city had fallen into German hands. The Germans immediately propagated that Stalingrad had been conquered. On the 8th of November, Hitler celebrated the victory in Munich, Germany's central city, and received congratulations. But this celebration of triumph was premature. The city hadn't been entirely taken. Instead, the scales were now tipping in favor of the Russians. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers had reached the eastern bank of the Volga, and preparations for a major offensive against the Germans were underway. In other words, reinforcements had arrived for the Soviet forces. On this extremely critical juncture, Hitler made two significant blunders, historical mistakes, such blunders that entirely shifted the momentum of the war. The first was terminating air support for his troops. It's evident that against the Russians, the German Air Force was their greatest asset. But now, as the Russian counterattack was imminent, Hitler began relocating most of his planes from Stalingrad to North Africa. This was because the Nazi general Erwin Rommel had suffered a defeat there, after which the positions of the British and the Allies in Africa had significantly strengthened. Hitler decided to empty Stalingrad's front to reinforce North Africa. Following this, only about 402 planes remained in Stalingrad for air support, which proved to be insufficient. Hitler's second major blunder was the continuous delay in sending reinforcements to the Allied troops surrounding Stalingrad. It's known that along with the Germans, there were Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian contingents. These forces had surrounded the city and kept it under siege. To the south of the city, the Romanian Fourth Army was stationed, while the north was guarded by the Third Army and the Italian Eighth Army. However, these forces severely lacked anti-tank weapons and modern armaments. They watched the enemy's preparations from across the Volga. Several requests were made to the Germans for more arms and assistance, but Hitler did not immediately aid them. Even the German commanders were increasingly concerned about significant losses and the enemy's preparations. Moreover, the harsh winter was wreaking havoc. Snowfall was constant, and temperatures had dropped to -18 degrees Celsius or even lower. German soldiers didn't have the equipment for the winter season. In fact, their entire supply line had been affected. In these conditions, German commanders pleaded with Adolf Hitler, requesting permission to vacate Stalingrad and take a defensive position along the banks of the Don River to the west. Hitler's ego could not tolerate the disgrace of retreating. He firmly refused. This refusal cost him and his army dearly. November 19th was the day of the major Russian counterattack. Now, they had to attack, not defend. This attack, launched as Operation Uranus, involved 1 million Russian soldiers. The Russians advanced in two parts, from the north and the south. Russian troops crossed the Volga River and launched an assault on the Romanian positions. Faced with the fierce Russian advance, the Romanian soldiers were quickly defeated. Both Russian forces, overcoming all resistances in their path, met in the town of Kalach to the west of Stalingrad. Within just 3 days, Stalingrad was under Russian siege. At least 300,000 Germans and their allied troops were trapped in the city. Among them were thousands of Russian civilians who had been conscripted by the Germans into their army. The Germans called them Huis, meaning volunteers. So, friends, the German army, along with its allies, was now trapped in Stalingrad. Those who had laid the siege were now themselves under siege. But even in this situation, this army had one last chance to escape from the city before the enemy circle tightened. It was possible. But Hitler made another blunder. He sent a message to the trapped German commander, Paulus, instructing him not to try to break the encirclement. "I will send a relief army to rescue you," he said. The German commander obeyed Hitler's order, sealing the fate of his army. Hitler dispatched a relief army under Field Marshal von Manstein to Stalingrad from the south. This force was named Army Group Don. This force began its relief operation from the southwest of Stalingrad, codenamed Winter Storm. The German plan was to break the encirclement of Stalingrad and then hold their positions along the city and the banks of the Volga River. However, Russian forces quickly intercepted and blocked the German relief forces' path. 48 kilometers from Stalingrad, Winter Storm came to a halt, and this lone attempt to rescue the trapped Germans failed. During this time, a few German planes continued to deliver supplies to Stalingrad, but the amounts were minimal. The trapped German army needed at least 700 tons of food and other supplies daily. The German Air Force initially committed to delivering 500 tons and later 300 tons daily. But in the first week, the Luftwaffe managed to deliver only a total of 350 tons. That's 350 tons in 7 days instead of 300 tons daily. Of this, only 14 tons were food, with the rest being fuel and other items. The situation did not significantly improve for the Germans in the following weeks. There were several reasons for the failure of the Nazi Air Force. It became evident that their air force was severely deficient, if not entirely depleted. The few aircraft they did have couldn't always fly in the extreme cold weather conditions. Another significant reason was that Russian planes kept attacking German bases, decimating the remaining aircraft. Consider that on the 18th and 19th of January, the Russians destroyed 50 aircraft on a German airbase. The situation in Stalingrad was deteriorating rapidly. Soldiers received a meager ration, around 100 to 200 grams of bread daily. They even had to resort to slaughtering the horses, which were meant for carrying supplies for food. However, the horse meat would freeze so solidly that it had to be cut with a saw. The soldiers' uniforms were in tatters. To protect themselves from the cold, they wore torn, discarded Russian uniforms, and even bits of bandages. Some desperate soldiers tried crafting gloves and clothing from the hides of stray dogs and deceased horses, but the severe cold and hunger took countless lives. Thousands of soldiers' corpses lay scattered on the snow, with no one to bury them. On the other hand, the Russian soldiers besieging the Germans were comparatively relaxed. They had both protection from the cold and ammunition. They minimized their firing at the Germans and taunted them more, aiming to demoralize them into surrender. To mentally torment the Germans, they set up effigies of Hitler near their positions. Each effigy had a card hanging around its neck, reading, "Shoot me." Hidden inside every effigy were 2 grenades, so that if any German tried to remove it, it would explode. The Russians also installed loudspeakers near German positions. They constantly played melancholic music, interspersed with messages intended to demoralize the Germans. The Germans endured these excruciating conditions throughout December and January, yet Hitler was not prepared to surrender. On January 30th, Hitler promoted the besieged army's commander, General Paulus, to the rank of Field Marshal. Hitler believed that no officer of this rank in the Nazi army had ever surrendered. However, the Germans' position was bleak, with hundreds of thousands dead. What good are titles in such situations? The Field Marshal was powerless. On January 31st, the newly appointed German Field Marshal reached the Russian army headquarters. On his journey, he saw the bodies of his comrades at almost every other step. Overcoming this sight, he entered the Russian camp and surrendered. On February 2nd, on his command, all German soldiers in the city emerged from their shelters with raised hands and began to surrender to the Russians. Out of the approximately 200,000 German soldiers encircled, barely 91,000 Germans and a very small number of their allies survived. The rest had perished either from the cold or from combat. Those who surrendered were sent to Russian camps. A grim irony is that out of the nearly 100,000 German soldiers who surrendered, hoping to save their lives, only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The remainder met their end within these camps. The Battle of Stalingrad resulted in immense casualties for both the Germans and their Axis allies. Their losses ranged from over 600,000 to 700,000 soldiers, either killed or wounded. On the other side, the Soviet army suffered even greater losses, with more than 1,128,000 soldiers either killed or wounded, exceeding 1.1 million casualties. Despite these losses, the Soviets emerged victorious. The conquest of Stalingrad was a decisive victory for them. This compelled Hitler to recall the forces he had dispatched to southern Russia to seize the oil fields, specifically Army Group A. Following the events in Stalingrad, the Germans were defeated on multiple fronts by the Soviets. Their momentum was lost, whereas the Red Army gained significant momentum. Merely 2 years after the surrender, Hitler committed suicide, leading to the fall of the Nazi Empire. Comrades, the Battle of Stalingrad was one of the most pivotal and intricate battles of the Second World War. We've endeavored to simplify and present it in an easily comprehensible manner, ensuring that the facts remain accurate for a comprehensive understanding of the war's narrative. Please share your thoughts on this video in the comments. We plan to bring many more stories from the world wars for you.